of you. This, I must say, this event is always very special to me. I'm coming on now 10 years associated with the school, and the events are just extraordinary. But the best part about them is seeing former students. So I very much hope that I'll get to see many of you later on today, and also that this reminds you of what the lectures were like that you've had at the school. But it's my absolute pleasure to be chairing this talk with one of the most distinguished diplomats Britain has ever produced, Sir Jeremy. And the topic we're going to converse about today is what if the world had no borders? So if you imagine a world where there are no political borders, nation states, we're going to explore this theme and think about how it affects the global economy and how one does business. Now, when I was at university, I remember reading a book by Benedict Anderson who essentially said, all national borders are man-created. There is no border that separates any country. And in fact, these borders get redrawn. So this is a theme that is absolutely worth thinking about as we are facing, especially in the Middle East, which we'll go into, a fragmentation and perhaps a redrawing of key borders over the next few decades. So without further ado, let me just say I'm going to ask Sir Jeremy that question, but also to let you know, in true LBS fashion, there'll be a chance for you to ask Sir Jeremy questions towards the end of this session. So let's just start with Sir Jeremy. What if the world had no borders? And what scenarios could we be looking at over the next few years?
If the world had no borders, there would be chaos. And the human mind is absolutely geared to creating borders. So a world with no borders would quickly reform with different borders, because the first thing that the human mind does is to make distinctions. The first thing that a small baby does is to decide who's for it and who's against it, where the borders are. We distinguish ourselves in our lives, in our cultures, in our politics, in our societies from others. That mental approach to making distinctions will quickly redraw some borders if a magic wand wiped them out. Now, you're quite right that borders are artificial. Borders are just the expressions of distinctions that human societies have chosen for a particular time, and they have always changed. In the 20th century, we invented a system after two absolutely catastrophic wars where there would be stability that saved the world from the scourge of war. But if that stability is unchanging on the compromises of a particular date in history, like 1945, those compromises will run out of steam, and in 2015, 70 years on, they won't be working and those borders will look wrong, because the institutions that we create do not change as fast as the world changes, so they fall behind, they fade in their effectiveness, and we need to start inventing new borders against the strains of those compromises not working. So as we look at and Linda took us through that story just now, as we look at the whole world open to us with no borders for opportunity, no borders for risk, the human mind says, I'm not safe in such a world, I must create borders for my own security. And it starts all over again.
I want to focus on the Middle East, Sir Jeremy. We are seeing potentially borders being redrawn. We are seeing dramatic shifts in the political divisions within that region. So I know that you focused on fragmentation of the political system. So do say a word about how you see that scenario playing out.
Well, let's look at why the Arab Spring happened, Linda. I don't think it was particularly Arab. I don't think it's proved to be a spring, but we've given it that name. the Arab world was the first to get into what is a global phenomenon of using the freedom that has come out of a much more advanced, a much more informed, a much more open, a much more meritocratic world to tell their rulers that what they were getting from them by way of social and political and economic organization was not good enough, was not giving them the dignity of a human life. And it happened first in this era, in the Arab world, because in the 20th century, the very talented Arab race was left further behind by history and circumstance than any other region. Now, is that true of the Arab world as opposed to Africa or Latin America or other regions? Well, certainly Asia took its opportunity in the 50s, 60s, 70s to grow a completely different approach to economic organization and hard work and production. Africa got left behind, but the potential of Africa was much lower because of history and the lack of organization following the colonial period. In the Arab world, there was talent, there were resources, there was organization, but the Arabs were like a group of football partisans in a stadium where their team had not just not won a match for 70 years, they hadn't even scored a goal. They were left miles behind a connected world, a progressing world that they could see through their information coming in that they were being left behind, and they were not going to put up with that. And so it was their sense of identity changing into something more collective through the instruments that they had with growing technology. They began to talk to each other about breaking the mold. But breaking the mold is one thing. Creating the next mold is another thing. And our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya actually managed to remove a regime in each case, but could not create the replacement regime because that has to come out of the people who own the territory. In a freer, more open, more meritocratic, more equal world, it's up to the people of the locality to choose who they want to govern them. And that has not been possible to organize in the Arab world because in wiping out the regimes, we wiped out the institutions that went along with those regimes, and nothing so far has replaced them. So there is a long period for the Middle East, the Arab world, to go through before they recollect that sense of coalition, compromise, identity, which we've taken 800 years to do since Magna Carta. They'll need time for it before they form an ordered society.
How do you see the dynamics around the Islamic State playing out in that region? Because they are attempting to redraw some of the borders, some would argue.
The Islamic State are one of those groups, and they're not the only type of group. Organized crime is another area which is similar to what Islamic State has been doing, where they've managed through quite clever strategy and tactics to take over space that was not properly governed by anybody else to create their own cultural identity. Now, we've been talking about an opening up world, about a connected world, about a world with different forms of leadership and governance, but where those new ideas are not working, where they're not creating an ordered society, where there isn't a balance between freedom and order, as in many places there isn't a good balance, then groups that want to create a different identity and a political space for that will start taking over those badly governed or ungoverned spaces and begin to produce their own world, their own society. And what Islamic State are doing in a very brutal way, and I would say a way that you can't properly call religious, is very political, is very human, is very tribal, because our default setting, when we have the freedom to go to our default setting, is tribal. Whether literally or metaphorically, we human beings are tribal. And Islamic State are giving expression in the most extreme and violent way to that demand for a tribal setting that satisfies their own, we would say, warped and distorted objectives and preferences. And Iraq and Syria are not strong enough states to deal with that. The Sahara is not an ordered enough territory to deal with those groups that are taking over the ungoverned spaces.
I want to come back to this theme of fragmentation and globalization. We saw from the audience question that Linda had posed that 3/4 of you, most of you, don't think that governments are doing enough to support essentially connected markets, the globalization phenomenon that we see make it easier to do business globally. So there is some doubt as to whether or not we are all converging in a globalized world towards one interconnected market sufficiently supported. But that is one dominant argument we hear quite a lot. But I believe, Sir Jeremy, you would argue the opposite, that we're actually becoming more fragmented as a global political entity.
Globalization is only affecting certain things. And I think we've made a mistake in our analysis and in the comment that we're hearing the whole time. It's all about globalization. But globalization is really only affecting two huge categories of human interaction. One is economics and commercial exchange and movement and interaction on the commercial and economic space, and the other is in information in all its manifestations, all the way through to the most modern technology. In globalization and communications, in economics and communications, we have globalized. But there is a reaction. In physics, there's always a counter-reaction. In human affairs, there's always a counter-reaction. We are polarizing in our culture, our identity, our religion, if you like, because that's an expression of culture, and therefore in our politics. So what we're seeing in a more disordered, a more competitive world is the tension between the globalization of some things and the polarization of others. And interpreting that and seeing where gravity is going to pull the interaction of events and people is the way to interpret what's going along in your environment. Linda talked about knowing yourself. And that is the start. You've got to know your strengths and weaknesses. The world is being reduced, if you like. It's being expanded in all the ways you're going to discuss today, but it's being reduced to the individual again. Because we are so aware of what we are in our own environment. But we're not necessarily right about what we are in our choices, in our judgments, in our estimations of ourselves. But we've got to get that right to be successful. Then we have to know our environment. And only when you know yourself and know your environment do you know the plan. And it's in that order. I have asked myself the question, what made human beings the dominant species? What was it? We weren't the biggest, the strongest, the fastest, the ones with the best teeth. What was it that made the human beings so dominant that we're beginning to eradicate a faster number of other species than in any other previous point of existence beyond the asteroid impact? What is it? It's three things. And these three things remain important, not just at the beginning of human existence, but in the organization of every human organization and group. They are intelligence, adaptability, and teamwork. And if you've got all those three going for you, you're going to survive, you're going to succeed. But if one of those is missing, you make the analysis wrong, you rely on a particular form of unchanging environment, or you're short of allies and partners, you're going to fail. And that exists for business now or for the first human being in Olduvai Gorge. It's the same process.
Sir Jeremy, what you described, I thought was a fascinating tension between globalization of markets, of economics, of technology, communication in particular, and the polarizing trend in politics. Now, I'd like to see how that would affect economies, economic performance, and the Eurozone comes immediately to mind. A monetary union which joined together markets. If you share currency, you really are joined together in many, many senses. And yet politically, it seems the institutions, the political cohesion isn't there. In fact, we hear the term democratic deficit quite a lot with relation to the Eurozone. Are they an example, a good example of how institutions always lag this globalizing force of markets? And if so, where does this go?
The EU...
I'm pushing you to make predictions about the future, as is the theme of, of this morning, so of this entire day. So,
I'm very careful not to make predictions. What we need to do is understand the probabilities and therefore narrow our choices, particularly business or political choices, to the most likely probabilities, gauge more accurately than your competitors. That's the point of business judgment. And the EU has hit a problem, that it's trying to be more collective than people's natural instincts want to be. Start with the tribe. Does the EU look like a single tribe? If the answer, which most people's answer will be, is no, it does not look like a single tribe with one identity, then what is the reason for holding the larger collective together? Is it fear? Is it greed? Is it self-interest? Is it a particular objective that we've all put number one? At the beginning of the EU, it was fear of war and of Germany doing it again, or of Russia coming westwards, which also underlay the beginning of NATO as well as EU, which was a reason for the EU surviving in security terms. The EU began with many compelling reasons, including business in coal and steel, for coming together and having an advantage from coming together. Over the 6 decades since then, those reasons have faded. And coming through have been the tribal instincts that we want to live in our own set of identities with people we're familiar with. I often put the question in seminars, do people want to be taxed in another language? It's not comfortable to have your tax bill coming through interpreted from another language in another capital. The tribal instincts of each people or sub-peoples in the European Union are stronger than their wish to be together through fear of something else. So in the 28-country collection, we've got a wider spectrum of collective instincts than the EU can hold together in one organisation. Now, there may be reasons for reforming that. There may be a very good objective in creating an economic space, a commercial space, a trading space that is more important than having our own individual national identity within the EU. But at the moment, I don't see it. At the moment, the difference between Germany and Greece is too big for a single organisation to hold together with one set of rules. I think this week they may find another way of keeping it going for a bit longer, but the trends are pulling it apart until that reason for reforming the collective at a larger level makes itself very clear to a majority of EU citizens.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice encapsulation, I think, of some of the inherent tension, which I'm actually going to put to the audience. I'd like you to raise your hands if you're from Germany. Anybody from Germany? Okay. Can you raise your hands if you're from Greece? Okay. Anybody from France? Okay. Anybody from the United States? Anybody from Europe? Okay, this did not work. And the example I was going to give was, if you ask an American, they always say they're American. And then you ask them, where are you from in America? and then they'll say, I'm from Texas, which I am. But if you ask a European, they'll say they're from Britain, they're from Germany, they're from Greece, they're from France. And they don't say European first. And it took the Americans a century or more to form that identity, that collective identity. And I think what you've touched on very, very clearly is that Europe is not yet there, or perhaps won't get there. But this idea of being European, getting your tax demand in another language, that's picking up this idea that the collective identity isn't quite there. You don't identify yourself first as European versus, say, from another nationality. It's a completely different mindset. And then the willingness to accept political institutions, I think, stems from that.
The Europeans may get there. They've got some choices. And they may reform, recollect, and decide on a number of choices where it works. It has been the biggest, best, most successful experiment in continental collectivism in global history. An absolutely extraordinary phenomenon. But I don't think it can go all the way to a single United States of Europe. And let me push back a little bit, Linda, on America. When I lived in America in the mid-70s, yes, and my English children went to school and sang I Love My Flag, the red and white and blue, every morning at school as English children. Yeah?
We do the
there
Pledge
was a
of
collective.
Allegiance. Yeah.
Everybody was American. When I went back in the 1990s and was talking around America to Americans, they very quickly said, but actually we are Irish American or German American or Swedish American or Mexican or Spanish, Hispanic American or Chinese American. The second adjective was much more prevalent in 1990 than in 1970. And I think in 2015 you will find those polarizing extra adjectives coming through more strongly even in America.
Yeah, fascinating. So Jeremy, does this make it harder to come up with collective solutions to big problems like climate change, like inequality, if you have a polarizing political force working against the integration in other respects of markets and of technology and of people becoming interconnected?
Yes, it does, because nation-states are still the pivotal structure of human global organization. Nation-states are becoming weaker because global concepts and global citizenship and the global expanse of our minds is pulling it one way, and local preference and local identity and the power of the individual in a democratic state, even the power of the individual with information in an autocratic state, is leaching power out of the central government. So the pivotal organization of our existence is being weakened in two directions. And it's very difficult as politicians fight to cling on to their power in their national context, not really changing their methods of seeking and holding on to power, don't know what to do about the global and the local. And so they're making more mistakes and getting less respect and having to deal with a more complex world, and their people aren't following them. And most of them are making a very crucial mistake. This is about global leadership. This is about leadership this day. The shape of leadership is changing. It's no longer seen as an apex shape. The shape of leadership is circular. Sometimes you're leading, sometimes you're following, and you've got to know as a leader when to listen and when to speak, when you're following and when you're leading, but you must show that circular shape to your leadership and not that apex shape. Top-down no longer lasts for very long. You have to be very efficient at repression to be top-down for very long. You have to listen. And that is coming through in every aspect at the moment of human organization, of individuals who are so well informed and have such a clear understanding of what they want from life.
Taking it deeper into the business context, what does all of this mean for leadership in running a global business?
It means that we must refine collectives. We keep on talking about the Middle East because the violence in the Middle East is in our face. And your first regional question to me was about the Middle East. what's the next headline IS are doing or happening in Yemen or Syria or Libya. The Middle East is going through a lethally violent and difficult phase, but for most of us, the waves of trouble coming out of the Middle East will not be existential for our societies. What could be, what maybe will be, would be the breakdown between the great powers, because the waves from a big power breakdown with the weaponry that they've got will be much greater, much more tsunami-like than the waves from a regional breakdown or from individual state crises. There we were voting a few minutes ago for state breakdown or crisis as being the most worrying issue. That was, to my mind, the right answer. Because if we can't organize ourselves with our new freedom and give something back to the balance of order, then the opportunity to experience that freedom and use it will be lost through the breakdown of order. So we have to have a balance there, and a loss of balance between the big powers, the continuing in competition between states who are fighting to keep what power they think they had in history, in recent history, could be very damaging unless leaders start talking to each other and form a circular relationship, a compromise relationship between the big states, rather than a competitive and apex-driven one.
Before I open it up to the audience, the United States and China are meeting in Washington, D.C. today. Are they at the very top of your list of major powers that need to have a different relationship? And do you see others as part of this major power group whose breakdown in relations could have huge repercussions for the world of business, indeed for everyone?
Well, yes, Linda, if I had one wish for a relationship to go right, and I'd have to describe what it means by going right, it would be the G2, the US and China. Because a breakdown between them means you can't organize anything in the rest of the world's global problem solving, whether economic arrangements, trading arrangements, climate change arrangements, security arrangements. They've got to have the involvement of the US and China before anything else if there is to be global level solutions. You can have regional solutions, and trade patterns, trade negotiations have collapsed down from the global to the regional in the last 10 years. The Doha round has not been successful. It's now done regionally or in ad hoc arrangements of TPP or TTIP or the Latin American arrangements on an ad hoc basis. The US and China have got to have a relationship that avoids war, that avoids the ultimate competition. And yet, the Americans I know and respect so highly seem sometimes to need an enemy. For their own identity, they seem to want somebody on the other side of the net to be contentious with. Because the Americans have created something that they're very protective of, but they've also created a status for themselves which has given us our global freedoms, but not the instruments to defend it indefinitely into the future. This audience today should be asking themselves the question, how long can this long period of global peace last when every other one in history has, by definition, ended in a war, in a catastrophic war? How do we avoid that process of human interaction that goes from collectivity and creativity to progress, to use of resources progressively, to competition for those resources, to conflict, to war, to regret, to re-collectivizing, to creating, to progressively improving, to compete? There seems to be a cycle. How do we stop that cycle from going into another violent war when it's never happened before? Something different has got to happen before we're 100 years on from 1945.
Fascinating stuff. I want to open it up to the audience, and just on this G2 point, Larry Summers, we saw a picture of him earlier, he was the U.S. Treasury Secretary. He once said that if you ask the Americans, in their heart of hearts, the G8 is okay, but nobody really wants Russia in it. The G7 is okay, but half the countries are now no longer the biggest economies. In their heart of hearts, Americans just want to be the G1. And, okay, if you'd like to ask Sir Jeremy a question, I thought it was an absolutely just fascinating set of insights. Please raise your hands, and there'll be a microphone coming around. Please introduce yourself, and we'll pose some questions to Sir Jeremy. Question right there, in the middle there. Your photos come faster than your microphone. There we go.
Thank you. Alan Newman from YouGov. So, Jeremy, you finished on the question of war. When there was a question of the British potentially intervening in Syria, we ran a survey, and forgive this commercial for YouGov, but it is relevant to the question because we actually did report, I think, with the first survey to show that the British people didn't want to go to war in Syria. Is one of the ways of avoiding war the fact that with modern communications, people actually very quickly see the horror of war? In other words, could the First World War have happened with iPhones and all the other means for people to understand what it really is? And is that possibly what will prevent war, that sheer horror will be so obvious to everyone?
It's absolutely right. We fully understand the horrors of war, and the UN, which I'm very familiar with, and now try and promote inside the UK through the UN Association, has, I think, explained in its norms and principles and in its peacekeeping and mopping up activity through all its agencies what the horrors of war are and how we should be avoiding them. And yet the human being still returns to the use of violent conflict because on each occasion it happens, there is a group which thinks that the use of violence is in its own interest. And people never stop thinking that they can use that instrument to get to an advantage, which we now know through the history of the 20th century reduces everybody's interests, diminishes everybody's life. But we haven't learned how to stop it. Because those political compulsions, that fight for power, that fight for space to direct one's own identity into a society, into an arrangement that will work, is such a strong instinct. The thing that we have learned since 1945, I think under the auspices first of the UN, but backed up by, as I said, the enormous momentum for freedom created by the leadership of the United States and the victory in the Cold War, that has made us understand the importance of dialogue and communication. I think there's only one way to avoid war, and that is to talk, as Churchill taught us. Jaw, jaw rather than war, war. And the UN is very good at that. The UN has instilled the habit between states of talking before you fight. So most of the violence you're seeing at the moment is started by people or between people who haven't been in that collective arrangement to talk before you fight, or have been so desperate, as the people in the town of Daraa in southeast Syria were 4 years ago, to start the rebellion, and so desperate and so angry and so disconnected that they had to use violence to show that they were determined to do something to change it. And so something started that they couldn't stop, because Syria is not a single civil war like the Spanish Civil War, where there were two clear sides that tore each other to pieces, but there were two flags. There are 100 flags around Syria, metaphorically. They're not fighting together against Assad and his regime in Damascus. They're fighting separately for their own local identity, taking on the colour of the local strengths and weaknesses. And we can't deal with that from outside. We learned in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya that we can, the American army and Air Force can take out a government, but they can't create the next one. We can only freeze a situation. And when we eventually go away because we've lost legitimacy in that intervention, we're not part of the locality, it goes back to square one where we left it when we went in, and they start all over again. I suppose what I'm saying in answer to your question is we cannot eradicate violence from our society unless we have quite different arrangements, and I fear that those arrangements would be extremely top-down and repressive if violence was to be totally eradicated. Or we would become not humans but zombies. So we've got to learn to deal with at least a modicum of violence in the situations that we're facing. And sometimes we just have to wait for that violence to be exhausted, where people decide to move on, as in Northern Ireland, as in Sierra Leone when we intervened. Perhaps the largest state, quite a small one, the poorest in the world, where an intervention actually worked. That and half worked in Kosovo, but anything bigger than that we can't do. We have to wait for the progression of localities to get together and form a coalition to create a state. It's a rotten answer because violence will happen. But I don't think I can tell you that there's a way to avoid violence altogether.
There's a hand in the back there and a hand in a couple of rows before. And there's one there as well. We're running out of time, so would you mind if we gathered all three questions? And
yes, by all means.
Okay.
So, Jeremy, Paul McCarter, an alumni from London Business School. I just wanted to link back to one of the things that Linda said. She mentioned that if you filled a bus full of the richest people in the world, it would overtake about 50% of the rest of the population. And I'm curious to know about this disproportionate allocation of wealth through the world, which seems to be accelerating, whether or not you feel that this will play majorly into the instability in the rest of the world going forward, and indeed if there's anything governments or we can do about it.
Thank you.
What was that? What will cause instability?
Extreme inequality. So this Oxfam study found 85 richest people have as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population, is 3.5 billion people. A question here as well.
Sorry.
Okay.
Luke Pittaway, Ohio University. My question, obviously you talked very clearly about US-China relationships. I think a lot of us were, when we answered, were worried about Russia and Russia and Ukraine situation. So I'd be interested to expand a little bit on that right now.
Yeah. Thank you. I think there's a question here as well. Yes, right there. So pick up this one and then we'll have you answer if we could. Could a microphone find its way to the middle?
Good morning. Actually, building on the point before last.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sorry. My name's Alan Coftree from Tech Option. The point before last, really building on that, we've heard a lot about the acceleration of technology innovation. And my question really is, if we see, as we appear to our sort of 20th century industrial and economic organizations delivering a lot of Keynesian leisure time by driving a lot of us out of work, which we're perhaps seeing, at least in the short term, among youth, in youth unemployment. My question is, can our 19th century style of politics deliver a utopia, or will it be dystopia?
Thank you.
Say that again.
Whether our 19th century politics applied to a 21st century world will end up in utopia or dystopia. We'll pick up, there's so many more questions. Could we, we'll just pick up one more and then we'll have you answer the question. Sorry, okay.
My name's Lucy Slinger from Shell. And I also studied at LBS. Do you think the increasing presence of women in institutions can help us to avoid war?
I'm going to say yes to that one.
So do
Jeremy.
I.
Yeah.
I'm in the middle of a campaign to make the election of the next Secretary General of the United Nations, first of all, a meritocratic exercise next year, not a P5-dominated one, and there must be a female candidate on the shortlist.
Wonderful.
Equality,
Ukraine,
Russia and
yes.
19th century politics and technology. There will always be some inequality, but we must limit it. If the spectrum is there, that's containable. If the spectrum is there, that's breakdown, that's violence. People will react, people will migrate, people will rebel, people will not accept it. If the spectrum is so wide, it's okay if there are a few rich people out there. There are going to be rich people out there. People have leaders, they respect chiefs. But if that wealth is used in the wrong way, in an insulting way, that increases the burden of inequality. And if the inequality is so wide that it is just demonstrably unfair, and there is no flow down of resources back down to those who need it to survive, then there will be revolutions. I come back to the balance between freedom and order. There must be that balance, or we cannot enjoy our freedom. There must be that smaller spectrum of inequality, or the unequal will destroy the most equal on the 1984 basis of equality, that some are more than others. So yes, there must be a devolvement of a distribution of wealth to keep that spectrum within manageable limits. Russia is important because Russia can be destructive. But why the G2 is important is that those two economies are the two largest economies. Russia does not have much of a say in the management of the next stage of the global economy. And that's the difference between Russia and China, apart, of course, from the fact that China is something like 10 times the population of Russia. Asia is the melting pot of this next decade or next generation, and Russia has a strong foothold in Asia, but China is at the center of the evolution of the next building block of global cooperation or global lack of cooperation, and the interface between China and Russia at the base of what so many other countries will want to do around them and with them, very often in an ad hoc way of organization, because it's becoming an ad hoc, not an institutionalized world. The United States and China must be there first, even if the relationship between the United States and Russia, Western Europe and Russia, is absolutely essential to avoid one of the points of potential war. Where did the first two world wars come out of? One, Serbia, two, Poland, if you like. We don't want the third one coming out of Eastern Europe. Perhaps the question is really about the return of politics to a post-Westphalian treaty arrangement of nation-states with a balance of power between them. I think it is becoming like that. But there's an extra power out there beyond the visibly divided, compartmentalized, territorialized nation-states, and that's the voice of the people. That is a new superpower which has to be built into the organization of politics so that leaders are truly facing a four-dimensional governance picture, not a two-dimensional one between top-down powers arranging things as they wish. It's politics for power, it's the politics for solving problems, it's politics for the people, and it's time, the fourth dimension. Politics is so short-term. I saw short-termism was up on the board a few minutes ago as one of the problems. Strategic decision-making has to be measured over time. Most governments most businesses don't feel that they've got time. So add time into the dimension of your decision making against all the other things that you have to bring in, and you will be getting to those intelligent, adaptable, shared decisions that might make your business survive and be successful.
I think it's a lovely note to wrap up on. I'm just going to ask you 2 quick-fire questions, Sir Jeremy, if you indulge me. One is, which country are you most worried about in terms of geopolitical risk?
You can't boil it down, Linda, to a single subject. At this moment, I want the Russia-Ukraine problem solved more than anything else.
That's a fair answer.
But if I had to give you an answer, I would say the United States.
United States, okay. And then the last one, which country do people worry too much about that you think maybe they don't need to?
China.
I think there's going to be a lot to ask Sir Jeremy about over coffee, but for now, please join me in thanking him for such a terrific session.